Hello, and welcome to Bear Necessities. My name is Bear, and today I want to give my review of WoW Classic Season of Discovery Phase 2. Phase 3 starts up tomorrow, so I really wanted to express my thoughts before the drop and hope for better things next phase. In short, Phase 2 was a pretty big disappointment for me. I raid logged most of the expansion after going hard for the first few weeks because it overall just wasn't as fun as Phase 1 to me. Here's my biggest gripes. First up, leveling. Leveling at the beginning of Phase 2 was a slog. By the time I hit 40 for the first time, I swore off all alts because of how mind-numbing it was. While I know the journey of leveling is supposed to be fun, even for someone new to the game, it got old quickly doing the same dungeons over and over again. Also, the questing experience for Horde seemed a little strange. From 1 to 25, there was a pretty straightforward progression of levels. From 25 to 40, you start to have so many options, and if you're new, you either have to look up the options or hopefully just stumble on a quest that leads you somewhere. Also, once you get to that camp, you may have 2 to 5 mid-20s quests, and then a bunch of 35 to 40 quests, so you have to shift to a different zone a lot. It just seems kinda weird for someone newer to the game, especially when it's pretty different from the first phase. Also, the questing route for leveling is kind of disincentivized because if you grind dungeons to max, then you can go back and do quests after and get a lot more gold from them, which leads me to my second point, gold gating. Listen, I played a lot of alts in P1, so gold in P2 was not an issue for me at all, but a lot of my buddies only played 1 to 2 characters in P1 and they struggled with gold gated features. First, the mount was around 100 gold, so there's your initial grind. Then the Gnomeregan helmets cost lots of gold for the recipes and mats. Then, if you're a melee, you're spending tons on consumes for every raid rotation, and finally if you swap from melee to spell damage from P1 to P2, you can spend about 75 gold on the other pearl from phase 1. All of these gold sinks honestly made no sense, and it likely exacerbated the RMT problem, or just caused people to quit because the sinks didn't exist in P1. Alright, let's move on to talking about raids and class balance. Melee had it really rough this phase, unless you were a melee hunter or enhanced shaman. But in general, to min-max a melee, you use agi pots, strength pots, rage, mana, thistle tea pots, dragon's breath chili, food and drink, etc. For casters, if you truly min-max, you use wizard oil, maybe the enchants if you're an enchanter, and some basic food and drink. You likely don't need mana pots, but maybe you use 1 or 2 a raid rotation. So the cost in general to play caster is way less than melee. Secondly, the Gnomeregan raid is catered towards casters. Grubbus and Viscous Fallout are no big deal, but once you get to the mechanical bosses, it becomes a whole different story. First, they have extremely high armor, which is a nerf to melee that casters don't get. The mobs have knockbacks or positional abilities that certain melee have to account for, while casters can easily just keep blasting. And there are mechanics that require a decent amount of running around, like pushing buttons on the final boss. Finally, the rotations on most casters seem overall more simple than playing a melee, at least something like a feral druid. I'm maintaining a good amount of buffs and dots on targets, positioning for certain abilities, etc., and a lot of casters are pressing 1 through 5 on their keyboards. While I do feel that casters were a little undertuned in P1, I think the overcorrections in P2, along with aligning mechanics to their benefit, was just overkill. I swapped to Resto/Boomy midway through the phase because we needed heals at the time, but it was also the best DPS to effort ratio, and it was just so much more worth. Now let's move to talking about the Blood Moon event. And while honestly it was pretty fun when the metas were still evolving and during off hours, it was still a huge disappointment for me because of a few factors. First, the items for each class were not created equal. Some classes had huge incentives to farm and get some BIS items off of the Bloodcoin vendor, while other classes and specs got barely anything. I think for Boomkin, we had 1 to 2 items to farm towards and then we were done. Farming reputation was also way worse than P1. Warsong faction had loads of good items, including jewelry and best in slot forearms, while there are very few items on the AV faction that are good, in my opinion. I found myself going back and doing Ashenvale more rotations than doing the Blood Moon event. Secondly, there were huge lag issues in the beginning that were really never fixed, and honestly, only got resolved because people stopped going to the event. Third, the metas that evolved around Blood Moon, including mage boosting, were toxic. Overall, it just wasn't a great time, and this is coming from a Boomy that was one-shotting people with Star Surge at the beginning. I'm sad that Phase 3 will be more of the same because I'd rather make them make Phase 3 Ashenvale again over Blood Moon, and that's saying something. Finally, I will say that Phase 2 seems to be a decent learning experience for the WoW Classic devs. There's definitely a reason that Phase 3 was announced quickly, and we're getting it earlier than expected. There had to be some terrible metrics on their side, and there was a huge incentive to move along. But I will say the devs did fix some things over time. They balanced out some of the PvP issues with classes, the overall gold required for mounts, and eventually the Gnomeregan helms through incentivizing leveling alts. Everything always seems to get fixed with time, but I do think the turnaround on these fixes was overall slower than in Phase 1, leaving some players, like me, pretty disenchanted with Phase 2. A lot of the grinding and hard work I did in Phase 1 farming gold was utilized in gold sinks and Phase 2, only for the gold sinks to be nerfed, but I had already spent my gold. It makes me think twice about spending 50 gold for dual spec on the off chance it gets reduced to like 10 gold later on, and I'm out 40 gold. In terms of content, I do intend on putting up Phase 3 content. I was sick for the start of Phase 2, and I was coughing for the first few weeks, so I didn't really upload much. Also, I was overall pretty unhappy with the experience in Phase 2, so I didn't really feel super motivated to upload much. I think you saw that pretty heavily with other content creators as well. I mean, I know Guzu and Azaryu were playing some Palworld in Phase 1, but that was a pretty huge launch of a game. While this phase, they were playing stuff like a difficult game about climbing. If that doesn't tell you something, then it probably should. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you later.